All right, everyone. Today I wanted to explain some extremely important and also very misunderstood information about upgrading your gear at the blacksmith, and a very important concept that if you don't understand it properly, you can actually end up bricking your gear, and that is item point brackets and what actually happens to your gear when you end up reaching these item point brackets. Because like I said, this is something that is really misunderstood, so I'm going to explain this to you as best as I possibly can so that with this information you'll know going forward not to end up bricking certain pieces of gear. So let me go ahead and explain what I mean by item point brackets. Well, when you end up going to the blacksmith and you end up upgrading your gear, you can see the item level on your gear, and then when you upgrade it, it's going to increase the item level at the blacksmith. Now, when you end up upgrading your gear, conventionally, of course, you're going to think that all the stats on your gear are going to end up upgrading, so there's really no downside besides the actual material cost. But that is not necessarily true. There are actually at certain points in upgrading your gear, and this happens at certain item point brackets where there is actually the possibility that you end up losing stats. Now, that's a lot to kind of throw at you guys at once, so I'm going to explain exactly how this happens and exactly what you really want to be on the lookout for. So when you take a look at the gear that you're upgrading, you're going to see the item power. Like on this helmet, you can see that it's 660. That's the base item power. And then the plus 15 is the bonus that I end up getting from the 3 upgrades that I've done at the blacksmith. Now, when you end up upgrading your gear, when it doesn't end up crossing these item point brackets, what it's going to do is it's proportionally going to increase the stats by a certain amount. And what you'll see is I want to just focus on one stat in particular. Just as an example, like the healing received. You can see that this helmet had the potential to end up rolling between a 6.5 to a 13% healing received roll. So that's a range of 6.5%. And you can see that my helmet there rolled somewhere in the middle. In fact, and this is really important for the example that I'm going to use, is it actually rolled at the 60%, like 60% of the way through the 6.5 to 13%. So, within the top 40% of stats. When you end up upgrading this at the blacksmith, you will actually gain stats, but your stats will not actually move in that bracket. So it's not going to go from 6.5 to 13%. My healing received is not going to go, it's not going to move towards the lower end of the bracket. It's not going to move towards the upper end. It's going to stay at exactly that 60% way mark. And you'll actually see here that if you take a look at the preview, it'll go from 10.5% extra healing received, or what was it, 10.4% to 11.2%. And you can see that the new bracket there is 7.0 to 14%. Well, that 11.2 is still at that same 60% point. It hasn't actually moved in the bracket at all, right? And if you actually take a look with a range of 7%, so 14%, 7% to 14%, that's a 7% range. We rolled 11.2, which is 4.2% above the minimum out of a total of 7%. We are it's at the 60% point, right? Same as it is here, and that's going to happen at most of your upgrades. Now, the exception to that, though, is when your items end up crossing over certain item points or item power brackets. And these are very important numbers to know going forward in the future. You're going to want to write these down, maybe even memorize them, to be honest, because they're going to be incredibly important numbers to know as you're upgrading your gear. And those are 150, 340, 460, 625, and 725. And something very important happens when you end up upgrading your gear past these points. Now, normally, when you upgrade your gear, it's all going to upgrade, and it's going to stay. The ranges of the brackets are not going to change. If you rolled at the very top, for example, and this is another good way to show this, is if we take a look at a stat that is at the highest point in the bracket, like the barrier generation, right? 13% barrier generation. It has a bracket of 6.5 to 13%. So you can see that this helmet here rolled the best that it possibly can. Normally, when you end up upgrading it, it's going to stay at the max, right? It goes up by 1%, and you can see that it's 7% to 14%, but it's still at the 100% point bracket. Just like the healing received is still at that 60% point, it's not changing anywhere in between the actual bracket. Now, that happens almost always, except for when your gear crosses these item powers: 150, 340, 460, 625, and 725. And something very important happens when you end up upgrading your gear and it crosses one of these item power brackets. And what that is that it actually upgrades all of the different ranges on the actual stats, but even more importantly is it will actually re-roll where your stats place in the bracket. And so if we look at this helmet again, where it rolled in the, the 60% of the way through the healing received bracket and 100% at the very top of the barrier generation bracket, as long as I don't cross one of those item power thresholds, my rolls are going to stay at the top of the bracket. But when I do end up crossing one of these item power brackets, it's going to actually re-roll all of the stats. It will upgrade it to a higher tier bracket, but it's going to re-roll it. So if you have something at the maximum, like that barrier generation, it actually has the potential now to re-roll to a lower value. Now, the good news about this is you could actually preview what the roll is going to be before you actually end up upgrading at the blacksmith. And I'm pretty sure that the rolls that you get are already hard-coded into the actual item itself. I don't know any other explanation why you can actually preview them before you actually roll it, but I'll show you guys an example here of an item that is going to end up crossing one of those brackets. And that is going to end up being, let's see here, I believe it was these bracers right here. You can see they're at 706 plus 15, which is 721 item power. Now notice how 725 is a new item power bracket, and that means that it is going to actually re-roll all of those, all of the ranges of the rolls of my item. So you can see here that it's got 44. It does have that maximum int roll right there. The critical strike chance is towards the lower ends. The attack speed is at the maximum, and the fire damage over time is also at the maximum. Normally, if I were to upgrade it, it would keep those rolls at the maximum, but because I'm crossing over into a new item power bracket, what you can actually see here is that it is going to re-roll the ranges of those different stats. So now you can see that the intelligence is no longer, it's still an upgrade, but it is no longer maximum like it was before. Critical strike chance, the attack speed is no longer, it still gets an upgrade, but it's no longer a maximum. However, interestingly enough, and this is where you need to be really careful, where you can actually end up bricking certain items, is that there is actually a chance that you end up losing stats. This is the only time when you end up upgrading gear where it has the potential to end up losing stats, is when it crosses over one of these item power brackets, and it re-rolls. Say if you have a really high roll like I do on these gloves, it rolled maximum fire damage over time. When it re-rolls it, the minimum value of the new tier is not actually going to be higher than the maximum value of the last tier. You would think that it is, so that this can't happen, but that's not the case. You can actually see that the minimum value for the fire damage over time in the new threshold is 9.8%, whereas the maximum in the last bracket was 13%. So it actually has the potential to lose, 3 point something percent of its power. And you can see here that because my maximum rolled fire damage over time stat is now no longer maximum, I actually end up losing 2.5%. And this can happen with all your different stats, with all your different items, but this only happens when you end up crossing over one of these item brackets. So it's really important to know that not only does it generally upgrade the item itself, but when you do cross these brackets, it completely re-rolls the threshold that your stats can roll as well. So you need to be very careful at the blacksmith. Don't just spam click it. You shouldn't do that anyway, because this can really eat up a lot of your materials. But really take a look, especially when you cross these thresholds, to make sure that your important stats, like for me, fire damage over time is a very, very important stat. So if I'm losing 2.5% fire damage over time, that's actually kind of a big deal. And I would actually choose to not upgrade these, because the extra int, crit strike chance, and attack speed is not going to outweigh the fact that I ended up losing that 2.5% fire damage. So especially on stats that are really important for your build, be very mindful when it comes to upgrading these items. So I know I was a little redundant, but this is super important going forward, and I wanted to really explain it as crystal clear and as best as I possibly could. So hopefully this helps out going forward in the future. You guys could use this information to make sure that your character stays as strong as it possibly can. So with that being said, I think I'm going to leave it here. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully it helped out. And if you did enjoy, consider leaving a quick like, subscribe for more videos in the future, and until next time.